They never expected me to walk back through those gates. 12 years. That's how long it had been since I'd seen the Devaney estate in person. The last time I stood on this gravel path, I was 18, carrying a bag that held more fear than belongings. Now I stood here again, heels steady, heart armored, and a silence stretching across the vast front yard like the ghost of who I used to be. The house was still as grand as I remembered, white stone walls, wrought iron balconies, arched windows that used to gleam with pride. But now I noticed what I hadn't been allowed to before. The weeds curling at the edges of the driveway, the paint peels slightly around the columns, the cracks beneath the glamour. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a story unraveling. I walked slowly, my fingers brushing against the gate. No one met me at the door. No one rushed out with open arms. I hadn't expected them to. Still, the silence dug into my ribs like a reminder. I was not welcome. I never really had been. The butler opened the door eventually, stiff and unsure. His eyes flicked over me as if trying to reconcile the name with the face. "Miss Mira?" I nodded. He stepped aside. The moment I entered, it was like stepping back into a memory that had been poorly stored. Everything looked the same, but colder, dimmer. The walls, once full of laughter and noise, now carried an uneasy hush. My footsteps echoed through the hallway like a challenge. I found my parents in the sitting room. My mother turned first. Her hair was grayer now, her face more angular, but the sharpness in her gaze hadn't faded. She looked at me the same way she had the night she called me ungrateful. My father stood beside her, stiffer than I remembered, as if even his spine wasn't sure whether to support him or not. No one spoke. I didn't flinch. "It's been a long time," my father finally said. "You made sure of that," I replied, voice calm even. He looked away. My mother, however, didn't blink. "You got our letter," she said. I did. Quite the surprise. There was a pause. She didn't apologize. Of course not. That would require acknowledging what they did. And they never acknowledged anything unless it served them. "We're in a difficult position," she began, as if that explained everything. "Financially?" I asked. She nodded. "The estate, some of the trust, legal issues. Your uncle mismanaged a few. And you need help," I finished. "We wouldn't be asking," my father said, "if there was any other option." I almost laughed. But it wasn't funny. It was insulting. After everything, they still thought they could summon me like a ghost they banished, and now suddenly needed to speak to. "I'm not here because I care about your money," I said. "I'm here because someone in your circle decided to send that letter, hoping I'd return." My mother's eyes narrowed. "It wasn't us." "Of course not." The silence stretched again. "I let it. You didn't reach out for 12 years, I said. "Not when I was homeless, not when I launched my business, not even when it made headlines." "We didn't know," my father said too quickly. "You didn't want to know." They didn't deny it. I took a breath and looked around the room that used to be filled with polished silver and brittle praise. They thought I was here to beg, to feel small again. But I didn't shrink. I came to stand tall. Taller than they ever let me be. "Whoever sent that letter was right about one thing," I said, voice steady. "You are losing everything." And now they were going to see exactly who they left behind. The iron gates creaked open with a groan that felt too poetic to be real. Mira stepped through slowly, her heels clicking against the cracked stone driveway of the Devaney estate. 12 years ago, this place loomed over her like a fortress. Now it looked like a fading memory, still grand, but hollow. The manicured lawns were overgrown. The marble fountain hadn't worked in years, moss creeping over its edges. She passed by the guest wing windows where her cousins used to whisper behind curtains. She could feel the eyes now too, shapes moving behind glass, shadows that paused. Whispers rising and scattering like dry leaves. She didn't care. Each step carried her closer to the front door, and further from the girl she'd been the last time she was here. That girl had begged for her parents to listen. That girl had cried while her mother packed her things into a single suitcase, hands tight and movements colder than winter. "I hope you enjoy this freedom you're choosing," her mother had said, voice sharp. "Because when you crawl back, Mira, we won't be here." But Mira never crawled. She had walked out of this house with nothing. No money. No contacts. No direction except her refusal to become a bargaining chip in an arranged marriage to a man twice her age who thought obedient was the highest compliment. She remembered standing in the foyer, cheeks burning, voice cracking when she said, "I won't do it." She remembered the silence that followed. Her father, arms crossed, said nothing, just stared. Her mother whispered something to the maid, then turned and gave Mira one last look, empty but satisfied, like she was wiping a stain off her reputation. Now Mira stood in that same foyer again, taller somehow. Not in height but in presence. Her skin still remembered the feel of that moment, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the certainty that she was walking away from everything. But she hadn't walked away. She had walked toward something. She built a life with her bare hands. No shortcuts. No inheritance. She waited tables by day and sketched clothing designs by night. Eventually, her designs caught fire, one dress at a time. By the time she was 25, she was the founder of a fashion line whispered about in elite circles. By 30, she was the name behind half the gowns worn on red carpets. No one connected her to the Devaney family. She'd made sure of it. Now she is back. A maid opened the door. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by hesitation. "Miss Mira?" Mira didn't smile. "Yes." The woman nodded awkwardly and stepped aside. Mira walked in like she belonged there because she once had, and maybe still did, whether they liked it or not. Inside, the house buzzed. Soft murmurs floated through the hall. She caught snatches of sentences. "Is that her? I thought she, after all these years?" Cousins she hadn't seen since she was a teenager stared from the hallway. Staff paused mid-task. Some looked curious, some cautious. No one moved to greet her. "Good." She walked past the main stairwell, where family portraits lined the walls. Her photo had been taken down, of course. But she didn't need to see her younger self up there. She was the only one in this house who hadn't pretended the past didn't exist. She entered the drawing room where her aunt was talking to a family lawyer, her voice clipped and anxious. "We can't lose the estate. That's all we have left." Then she saw Mira. The lawyer looked up, blinking in confusion. "You're?" Mira nodded slowly. "I'm the daughter you all forgot." And none of them had a clue that the anonymous investor who had just offered to bail them out of financial ruin was her. She sat in the velvet-backed chair across from the same fireplace where her father used to lecture her about tradition, legacy, and duty. The flames now crackled weakly, like even the fire didn't believe in the house anymore. Myra's posture was effortless, poised, confident. Her black suit was tailored with surgical precision, more command than couture. She wasn't the daughter they exiled. She was the woman they never saw coming. 12 years ago, they thought they buried her future when they cast her out. But exile wasn't death. It was evolution. She had started with nothing, no family name to lean on, no inheritance, just grit and hunger. The first few years were brutal. No one took her seriously. She slept in hostels, borrowed internet from cafes, took jobs below her talent, and paid her dues 10 times over. But in the background, she was building something, learning the patterns, the rules, the flaws in the system. She worked under assumed names, ghost consulted for firms too proud to hire nobody. She made herself invisible until she was untouchable. By 27, she had registered her first investment firm, Delara Holdings. No one knew Mira Devaney owned it. She didn't need them to. What mattered was control. She bought stakes in companies most overlooked, failing legacy brands, small infrastructure projects, boutique banks with old money problems. Then, 2 years ago, she saw a familiar name pop up in a risk report, the Devaney estate. Drowning in quiet debt, trying to refinance through shadow lenders. Her breath had caught, just for a second. She had forwarded the report to her team with one instruction: purchase it, silently. Her lawyers were cautious. "This is emotional," they warned. "You're too close. Let it fall on its own." But Mira couldn't stay out of it. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want power. She just wanted to be there the moment they realized the legacy they were so desperate to protect had been saved by the daughter they tried to erase. so she did it quietly. Her firm assumed the estate's debt through a chain of shell transactions so tangled no one could trace the ownership. She stopped the impending auction. She halted the scandal. She protected their name like she had once begged them to protect hers. And now she was sitting in their drawing room, watching it all unfold. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Mira didn't move. The door opened. Viveka Devani entered, Myra's mother. Time had etched itself into the lines of her face, but the sharpness remained. She still wore power like perfume, thick, calculated, impossible to ignore. She carried a tablet, talking over her shoulder to an assistant about last-minute meetings with the estate board. Then her eyes landed on Mira. She paused, the shift almost imperceptible. Her eyes narrowed faintly, scanning the face in front of her. There was no recognition.
None.
Just polite confusion. "Can I help you?" Her voice clipped formal. Mira smiled, slow, careful. "It's been a while." Viveka blinked, searching her face again, and still came up empty. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" 12 years. And not even a flicker of familiarity. Mira leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Apparently not." Her mother tilted her head slightly, eyes sharpening. "Do I know your family?" Myra's gaze didn't waver. "You used to." Hooked in that moment of eerie calm, Viveka stood perfectly still until something shifted in her posture, like a faint memory clawing its way back. A pause. A breath held too long, but it was too late. She didn't recognize her daughter, and Mira had never felt so powerful. The silver clink of cutlery echoed like a heartbeat in the long, ornate dining hall. The Devani family dinner was as elegant as ever. Glittering chandeliers, servers in black and white, crystal glasses filled with aged wine that cost more than Myra's first year of rent. She sat at the far end of the table, placed neatly between a second cousin's new fiancé and a retired uncle who hadn't recognized her, not even a blink. To them, she was just another guest. A quiet outsider. They'd called it an intimate family celebration, but Mira hadn't been invited. The estate manager, confused and nervous after their earlier interaction, had mumbled something about protocol and respect and insisted she stay for dinner. She didn't argue. She wanted to be there. Her chair was the furthest from the head of the table. Her mother sat on the right of her father, still perfectly poised, her fingers wrapped around a wine glass like it was a symbol of power. Her father stood slowly, his napkin brushing to the floor, deliberate and practiced. He cleared his throat and raised his glass. "I want to say something," he began, voice carrying easily through the candlelit room. "In these challenging times, we have faced obstacles we never predicted, but we've endured. And we've done so because of one thing: loyalty. Family loyalty. Legacy." Mira stared at the flame of the candle in front of her, keeping her expression neutral. Each word dripped with irony. "This family," he continued, his voice heavy with self-importance, "has always stood together. Even when tested. Even when betrayed. We rise." The room politely applauded. No one noticed Myra's grip tightening on the stem of her water glass. She remembered rising too. Just not here. Not with silk napkins and silver platters. But in the hostel bunks with peeling paint. In cafe corners where she studied financial reports on stolen Wi-Fi. On night buses where she learned to sleep with one arm wrapped around her backpack. She remembered eating instant noodles in countries where she didn't speak the language, working cleaning shifts before interviews, taking freelance consulting jobs under a fake name because she couldn't afford to be Googled. She remembered what hunger felt like when it wasn't just physical but emotional, too. Starving for dignity, for even one person to believe in her. The speech ended. Applause again. Laughter picked up around the table. Toasts clinked. Small talk filled the air like perfume. Mira said little, listened more. Then something shifted. Across the table, a cousin, Lena, was watching her. Not with confusion, with caution. Her brows furrowed, lips parted slightly like she was about to say something, then thought better of it. Mira looked away. Moments later, as the dessert plates were cleared, a folded napkin was discreetly placed beside Myra's elbow. She opened it slowly beneath the tablecloth, her heart thudding. One line, handwritten. "Why are you really here?" Her chest tightened. Lena knew, or was close to knowing. Mira glanced up again, and this time, Lena didn't look away. She just held her gaze, quiet and waiting. Around them, conversation continued as if nothing trembled beneath the surface. But Mira knew the moment was coming. The thin wall between who she'd become and who they'd forgotten was about to collapse. Her mask was slipping. Her silence had an expiration date. And for the first time that night, she was ready for the reveal. The hallway was narrower than she remembered. Or maybe Mira had just outgrown the way this house once made her feel. Small, silent, dispensable. Her heels clicked softly against the polished wood floors as she reached the door at the very end. Her old room. She hadn't stepped foot in it in 12 years. The brass knob turned without resistance. The door opened to reveal boxes, shelves, labeled bins. A broken coat rack leaned in one corner, a dusty treadmill in another. The bed was gone. The lavender walls she'd painted herself had been coated over with bland beige. Her teenage self had been erased so easily it made her stomach turn. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The scent of old paper and forgotten things clung to the air. They hadn't even tried to preserve it, not even as a guest room, just storage. Her fingers brushed across a box labeled Old Photos. It was tucked beneath a stack of unused tablecloths. She pulled it free, carefully peeled back the tape, and reached inside. Most were formal family photos, posed perfect, performative. Holiday dinners, garden parties, charity events. But near the bottom was a smaller, unframed picture, bent at the edges. The backyard, midsummer. Her mother sat on the picnic blanket, smiling into the camera. Beside her, her sister Lena grinned, hair in braids. And between them, no, not between, there was space. A jagged tear ran through the right side of the photograph, and Mira could see where she had once been. Cut out, literally. Her breath caught. She didn't need proof they'd erased her. She'd lived it. But this was personal. This was meticulous. They hadn't just forgotten her. They'd rewritten the story, without her in it. She sank to the floor, still holding the photo. Memories blurred around the edges of her mind, sharp, painful. The last time she'd spoken to Lena had been a few months after Mira was thrown out. She'd called from a payphone outside a train station in Lyon, voice thin from hunger and cold. "Please," she'd whispered, "can we just talk?" There had been silence. Then her sister's voice, tired and tense. "It's better if you don't come back, Mira. Just don't. You know how they are. And I can't fix this." Click. That was it. That was the moment she realized she wasn't just unwelcome. She was unwanted. She had hung up and never called again. Mira stared at the photo in her lap, fingers trembling slightly. Her voice, quiet but sharp, cut through the silence. "They never expected me to become someone who could ruin them." She paused. "And I didn't expect to want to." But the more time she spent in these halls, the more the truth hardened inside her. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even about pain anymore. It was about truth, about reclaiming a place they stole from her, burned down, and tried to pretend never existed. The air in the room felt tighter now, like the house itself knew what was coming. Mira stood, folding the photo and slipping it into her coat pocket. She looked around the storage closet that used to be her bedroom and felt something final click into place. They had buried her, but she'd grown roots in silence. And tomorrow she'd bloom in their faces. By this time tomorrow, they'd know exactly who she was. And it would be too late to pretend otherwise. The ballroom glittered like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers, gold accents, violins playing a haunting overture. Everyone who was anyone in the city had shown up to the gala. It was the family's last chance to secure the investment that would save the estate from total collapse. The foundation had been hemorrhaging money for years, and tonight's announcement was supposed to be their redemption. No one knew the mysterious benefactor who had agreed to back the family's new development project. Only whispers floated through the crowd. An anonymous investor from a powerful private equity group, someone with deep pockets and strategic vision. The same firm that had quietly bought out the estate's debt, staving off a very public scandal. They didn't know it was Mira. Not yet. She stood at the edge of the room, dressed in midnight blue, a sleek mask covering her eyes. It was a masquerade-style gala, of course, another carefully curated attempt at elegance. But Mira didn't wear the mask for mystery. She wore it for irony, because that was how they liked their world: beautiful, selective, and blind to truth. Her father took the stage first, regal in his tailored suit, calm and confident as ever. He raised his champagne glass with practiced charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight marks a new era for our legacy. We're proud to announce a transformative partnership, one that will preserve our family's future and elevate this estate to new heights." Applause rippled. Cameras clicked. Behind him, a branded banner with the firm's logo slowly unrolled across the screen. Virex Capital Group. The crowd murmured. The name carried weight. Mira stepped forward then, heels silent on the marble floor. Every movement is deliberate. The room, still wrapped in its buzz of celebration, barely noticed her at first. Until she climbed the stage. Until she stopped beside her father. Until she spoke. "You always said I'd come back," she said, her voice low, steady, slicing through the room like a blade. "You just didn't expect me to own the room." The music screeched to a halt. Her father turned, confused. His smile faltered. Mira reached up and removed the mask. The gasp started then, sharp, stunned. Like the entire ballroom exhaled at once and forgot how to breathe again. She looked every inch the power they once said she'd never have. Diamond earrings, cold fire in her eyes. A woman who had survived the burn of exile and turned it into gold. Her mother stood in the crowd, frozen. A champagne flute trembled in her grip. "I'm Mira," she said into the mic, "the daughter you told everyone didn't exist. The one you banished for choosing her own future." The room went dead silent. "I'm also the managing partner of Virex Capital," she continued. "You've been negotiating with me for the past 6 months. Through lawyers, through screens, through fake names. And tonight, you almost signed away your last piece of pride." Someone dropped a glass. She turned slowly to face the audience, eyes scanning the stunned expressions. "But I didn't come here for revenge," she said, voice calm. "I came to show you what happens when you bury someone too deep. They don't disappear. They grow. And tonight, I didn't come for a seat at your table. I came to buy the table." Her father's face had gone white. Her mother whispered something, almost inaudible, but Mira heard it. "What have you done?" Mira looked at her, not with anger, but something stronger. "Pity." "I saved you," she said quietly, "but you'll never be able to pretend I didn't exist again." And then she walked off stage. The mask lay behind her like the past, finally discarded. Gasps still echoed around the ballroom as Mira turned back to face the stunned crowd, the stage now fully hers. Her father hadn't moved. Her mother's lips were parted, eyes darting toward the exit, like a cornered animal. But Mira wasn't finished. Not yet. She reached into her sleek clutch and pulled out a thin black folder. Nothing flashy, no theatrics. Just cold, crisp paper and hard truth. She opened it slowly, letting the silence stretch. "I'm not here to gloat," she said, her voice calmer now. "I'm here to let the record show exactly what you did." The room was frozen. Some guests had their phones up, recording. Others stood wide-eyed, caught between scandal and awe. "This," Mira continued, holding up a printed email, "is a letter sent from my mother's email account to the Delara Foundation in 2011. I had applied for a grant, one I desperately needed after you threw me out." She turned toward the crowd, holding it up. It reads, "Mira has a history of unstable behavior. We're concerned about her emotional volatility and poor decision-making. Signed, Vivian Laurent." A sharp intake of breath. She flipped to another page. "This," she said, her tone clipped, "is a handwritten note, in my mother's handwriting, sent to a former friend of mine. It warned her not to associate with me, that I was using people for money and attention, that I was damaged." Her mother took a step forward then, eyes wide. "Mira." But Mira didn't look at her. She was speaking to everyone now. "You didn't just cut me off. You made sure no one else would offer me a hand. You buried my name, poisoned every connection I had, made sure the only thing I'd be known for was being your shame." Her voice broke, not from weakness, but from the weight of remembering. I wasn't just abandoned. I was erased. A beat of silence followed, heavy, aching. Then a voice rose from the back. Enough. All eyes turned as a young woman in a slate-gray gown stepped forward from the shadows. Her sister, Amelie, the same sister who once watched her leave without a word, who hadn't reached out in 12 long years. Mira blinked, stunned. I remember those letters, Amelie said, walking slowly toward the stage. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. I found one in Mother's drawer once. She told me not to ask questions, that you were unstable, that you didn't want to be part of the family anymore. And I believed her. She turned to the audience. I didn't know the truth, but I do now. She stepped beside Mira. I'm sorry, she said. You didn't deserve any of it. For a split second, Mira looked like she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded, once. Thank you, she said softly. Then she turned back to the podium. There's one last thing. She held up a document, bearing the official seal of the estate registry. As of 2 months ago, Laurent Estate Holdings is officially owned by my firm, which is, as of this morning, fully in my name. The words hit like thunder. I don't want to destroy this place, she said, but I will not let it be run by people who destroy others. She faced her parents now, eyes like fire. You have 2 options. Sign over administrative control of the estate to a new independent board, or I release every document in this folder to the press by morning. Her father's lips parted, but no sound came. Her mother looked like stone. Mira didn't wait. The choice is yours, but the power is mine. The room cracked open with tension as her father stepped forward, his voice sharp enough to slice glass. You will never have my name, he spat, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. You think money makes you powerful? You think this little stunt gives you worth? His fists trembled at his sides. You're still a disgrace. You always were. Mira didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She looked at the man who once made her beg to stay, who signed away his daughter for pride, and now couldn't bear to see her rise. I don't need your name, she said, every word calm and precise. I built one of my own, and it's worth more than yours now. Not because of wealth, but because people respect it. Whispers rippled across the crowd like an earthquake's first tremors. Guests pulled out their phones. Security hovered at the edge of the stage, unsure of what to do. But Mira had already turned. She walked off the stage, past her father, past her mother who stood frozen, past a dozen relatives who once pretended she didn't exist. Not one of them stopped her. Outside, the cool night air met her skin like freedom. She didn't stop walking until she was out of sight of the estate. Her driver opened the door without a word. Inside the car, she let out a single breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 12 years. By morning, the collapse had begun. Headlines erupted like fireworks. Laurent family gala ends in chaos. Disowned daughter reveals shocking ownership twist. Private equity titan Mira Celine Laurent breaks silence and shatters legacy. The documents she'd shown, those carefully placed truths, circulated through media outlets and social feeds like wildfire. But it wasn't just the financial scandal that caught the public eye. It was the story. The abandoned daughter who rose from exile to secretly buy out the family that threw her away. In a world hungry for justice and poetic irony, Mira became a symbol. People posted their own stories under the hashtag Mira didn't teabag. Old classmates reached out. Women from her past internships. Former mentors. Strangers. Thousands of them. You gave me courage. They silenced me too. I needed this story more than I can explain. She sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through messages, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. For years, she'd thought of herself as a shadow. Now, she was a mirror for others. Her phone buzzed. Breaking news. Laurent Estate Holdings loses key investors. Financial restructuring fails. Assets to be liquidated. The home she was cast out of, the empire built on pride and lies, was falling apart. Not because she tore it down, but because the truth was finally louder than the myth they'd clung to. Late that night, the knock came. Mira had just finished brushing her hair, ready to melt into the quiet of her ocean view home. She didn't expect company. She opened the door. Her mother stood there. No pearls. No perfectly pressed coat. Just a scarf pulled tight, and a silence that tasted like surrender. Mira didn't speak. Neither did she. For a long moment, they just stood there. Two women on opposite sides of a war too old to name. And then, barely above a whisper, her mother said, "You made the world look at you." Mira looked her dead in the eyes. "No," she replied. "I made them see the truth." Her mother stood in the doorway, shoulders wrapped in a coat too thin for the wind, lips pressed together like they were holding back everything she'd rehearsed. Mira didn't move, didn't invite her in. She just stepped aside, quiet and calm, the same way the storm makes room for silence before thunder. Vivian Laurent stepped in like a woman entering unfamiliar territory, though she had once ruled homes like this, with grace that could wound. She looked around at the exposed brick, the bookshelves, and the minimalist art. None of it said Laurent. All of it said Mira. They sat at the kitchen island. 2 mugs of untouched tea steamed quietly between them. Her mother's fingers shook slightly as they curled around the ceramic. She looked older now, thinner, like regret had gnawed away at something essential. But her voice, when it finally came, still had that signature poise. "I didn't come here to fight," she said softly. "I came to explain." Mira didn't blink. "I don't need explanations." "I know, but I need to say it anyway." Her mother's eyes shimmered. "We thought we were protecting you. From failure. From judgment. That marriage was convenient," Mira cut in. "For you." Her mother flinched. Mira didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You told me I was your shame. You gave me an hour to leave and made sure no one in the family ever spoke my name again." Her mother's lips trembled. "I was scared of what people would say, of what your refusal would mean for your father's standing. You were so headstrong, so willing to walk away. I was 18. Silence fell. Her mother set down the mug. "I watched you walk out that night and thought, she'll come back when she understands the world. But you didn't." "I didn't," Mira agreed. "I followed your name over the years," her mother whispered. "But I didn't know it was you. Mira Celine. I didn't know until you stood on that stage." Her voice cracked. "I couldn't recognize my own daughter." Mira looked down for a moment, then stood, walked over to a small drawer near her desk, and pulled out a yellowed envelope. It was creased at the corners, edges soft from being touched too often. She handed it across the table. Her mother stared at it, confused. "I wrote this when I was 19, Mira said. "I was living in a flat the size of your walk-in closet. I had 1 coat, 3 plates, and no idea how to keep the heater running. I wrote it on the night I realized you weren't coming to find me." Her mother opened the envelope with slow, shaking hands. Inside was a single letter, handwritten in looping, uneven lines. "I never sent it," Mira continued, "because halfway through writing it, I realized it wasn't for you. It was for me. An apology I gave myself when you didn't." Her mother read silently, and as she read, the elegant wall she had maintained for a lifetime crumbled. Her shoulders fell. Her chin dropped. Tears slipped down without apology. "I failed you," she said finally, voice cracking in half. "Not just that night, but every moment after." Mira didn't rush to fill the silence. "I didn't come back to destroy you," she said, voice steady, clear. "I came to stop hiding from who I am." Her mother nodded, broken. "And who you are is extraordinary." Myra's throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She just said, "I always was. You just didn't want to see it." The halls felt smaller now, not in size but in significance. The chandeliers no longer glittered with intimidation. The marble floors, once pristine and hollow, creaked faintly beneath Myra's heels like they, too, were tired of pretending. She walked slowly, one hand grazing the velvet wallpaper in the East Wing, past portraits of ancestors who never knew her name, past doors she once tiptoed through in silence, afraid to disturb the quiet elegance her mother demanded, past the grand staircase where she had once stood in a borrowed gown, trying to be good enough. None of it mattered now. She reached her old room, the one that had been turned into storage. The furniture was different. The walls were repainted, but her shadows still lingered in the corners, like a memory unwilling to fade. She didn't linger. She just opened the door, stepped inside, and placed a small silver key on the empty shelf where her favorite books once lived. No note, no dramatic goodbye, just a clean break. Downstairs, the estate was empty. Her parents were gone, as were the staff, the guests, the noise. All that remained was silence, but not the kind she'd grown up with, the cold, biting silence of rejection. This one was still, clear, and peaceful. At the front door, she paused. 12 years ago, she had walked out of this house with a backpack, a broken heart, and no plan. That night, the door had clicked shut behind her like a gavel. Final. Absolute. She wasn't their daughter anymore. And for a long time, she thought that meant she wasn't anyone at all. But today, as she stepped outside for the last time, the air didn't feel like exile. It felt like freedom. Her heels touched the gravel, then the stone path, then the gate. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. There were no reporters, no cameras, no headlines screaming about the heiress-turned-tycoon. She hadn't sent a press release or held a press conference. The scandal, the estate's collapse, the betrayal, it was all over now. The world would forget, just like her family had tried to forget her. But that was okay. Let them forget. Because she remembered. She remembered the girl they erased. The one who was too bold, too honest, too unwilling to shrink herself to fit their mold. The girl who cried alone in a foreign country, who stitched together a future from nothing, who refused to disappear. And that's why she came back. Not for revenge, not for power, not even for closure. She came back to show that girl something. That she made it. That she was never the problem. That she was always enough. The gate closed behind her with a soft click. A final punctuation mark on a sentence that had taken over a decade to finish. Mira walked away. No security. No entourage. Just herself. That was all she ever needed. As the estate faded behind her, her voice echoed in her mind. Clear, certain, grounded in truth. They rejected me. They forgot me. But I didn't come back to hurt them. I came back to show the girl they erased that she was never the problem. She stopped at the edge of the estate grounds, where the pavement met the road. A taxi waited there, simple, quiet, ordinary. She opened the door, slid in, and whispered the final words to herself as the car pulled away. I'm not their daughter anymore. I'm finally mine. Have you ever been forced to walk away from your family just to protect your peace? If you did, would you ever go back? Or was walking away the real beginning? If this story hit you in the heart, tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. Subscribe for more raw, emotional stories that speak the truth we're often too scared to say out loud.